Well, Donald Trump has managed to do something that I guess what probably no president in modern history has been able to accomplish. He has convinced the people of the New York Times that the federal government should shut down. That's right. In a recent article by Ezra Klein titled "Stop Acting Like This Is Normal," they are actually advocating for Democrats to shut down the federal government. Now, that is quite an Overton window shift in modern presidential history. And the question is why are they saying this? Well, today we're going to look at three specific policies that have been widely mentioned by a variety of people across the entire spectrum of political ideology. The first one we're going to talk about has to do with Trump's policy on immigration. We're also going to talk about his policies with respect to combating the cartels, as well as whether or not it's legal to send the National Guard into certain cities which are struggling with crime problems. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at all of these today on Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines.
Doing well.
I didn't ask how you're doing. I just said that you were here.
I'm stating it as a matter of fact. I'm doing well.
All right, so we're going to jump right into this by going over to our friends over at Ground News. And we got a couple articles that we're looking at over here. One is Chicago prepares for an influx of National Guard troops and immigration agents. Another one has to do with the discussion on Venezuela to boost troops to tackle drug trafficking as U.S. strengthens military in the Caribbean. Now, keep in mind, as you're looking through all of this, the Ground News is both a website and an app, and it curates all the latest stories and provides you with insight into who is covering the news and why. In fact, if you go up to the article here, you can see over here on the bias distribution, it gives you a very nice graph highlighting who's covering it and what are the reasons they're potentially covering it. So if you are like us and you appreciate a little transparency that goes beyond just the headlines, I want to encourage you to go over to ground.news/MTA and get 40% off their Vantage plan for just $5 a month. You can check out all of their many features and get unlimited access to the same features that we use as we're trying to get stories for the topics that we cover in the podcast. Again, ground.news/MTA. All right, let's go ahead and start off with what we always do, and that is the framing portion of this. So since taking office, Trump has done a lot of things which have been considered controversial. I guess more controversial depending on or where you stand on the political spectrum. But interestingly enough, this article from the New York Times kind of takes it a step further. We're not used to Democrats being the ones calling for the shutting down of the government, but that's exactly what they're doing in this.
Yeah, that's true. So Ezra Klein, for those of you who might not know, he's a writer and podcaster for the New York Times. He put out this opinion piece just a couple days ago, and he basically is straight up calling for Democrats to shut down the government once funding runs out at the end of September. And his argument is basic. I mean, he lays it out right here at the start of it. He's like, well, Democrats can join Republicans to fund a government that President Trump is turning into a tool of authoritarian takeover and vengeance, or shut the government down. And obviously he's advocating for shutting the government down.
And some of the reasons he's doing so have to do with kind of the three topics that I mentioned in the opening here. But we have sending the National Guard into blue cities. And this kind of started with the D.C. crackdown. And the D.C. crackdown was unique because the president has the authority since District of Columbia. Washington, D.C. is not an independent city. It is technically the jurisdiction of the federal government. They have since granted it some home rule considerations to where they have their own city council, their own mayor. But the feds don't have to allow them to do that. And because of some high-profile crimes that were taking place in D.C., President Trump decided to federalize the Washington, D.C. Police Department and bring in the National Guard in order to assist in bringing about law and order. And so you've seen a lot of instances you've seen protests up there. What's interesting is there seems to be some differences between who's protesting and who actually lives in D.C. But there's no question that while that was controversial, what really kicked it off was this idea of Trump floating the idea of sending the Guard into places like Chicago. Now, within the United States, we obviously have posse comitatus laws, which says we don't use the U.S. military to engage in what we would call traditional police functions. The exception to that is the Insurrection Act. And so it's been used, fairly limited times. George Bush used it during the LA riots in Los Angeles, where they brought not only in the National Guard in, but they actually brought Marines in. They brought other troops in order to help put down the LA riots. You saw Trump saying he was going to use it before he with the LA again when it came to the ICE raids that were going on. But he's since talked about doing it in other cities that, based off of what generally gets considered high crime stats. But the question is that what the Insurrection Act is for? So that's one of the controversial policies. And whether or not he is, and he's talked about sending them into Chicago, and Chicago potentially not being the only place that they would go. We've got a article up here right now from ABC News. What is it? 58 shot over Labor Day weekend in Chicago as governor rejects Trump threatens to send in the National Guard. So obviously, the governor of Illinois, as well as the mayor of Chicago, have both been adamantly opposed to sending the National Guard into Chicago. The next one has to do with what we might call militarizing the war on drugs. And so it's important to understand that there's always been some military component to the war on drugs. We have the JTF-6 missions, which have included National Guard. You've had special operations units, which have assisted in counter-narcotics operations, 7 Special Forces Group down in South America, working with the Lanceros in Colombia, as well as other elements. So there's been a support role, but there hasn't been as much of what we're seeing now, which is kind of the threats of direct action, which that is potential drone strikes.
Not just threats.
Yeah, they've actually done it, right? The one that became that really grabbed headlines was they actually showed a video of a boat that was, again, allegedly, part of a Venezuelan criminal and terrorist organizations, designated as a terrorist organization within the United States, trafficking drugs. That I don't know if it was the U.S. Navy or the Coast Guard. So it just blew it out of the water, and that caused a lot of controversy as well. And then we have also, of course, the cases of the ICE and immigration crackdowns. And of course, the most famous being Kilmar Abrego, or as the media likes to call him,
just
Maryland
will not
man.
leave the news cycle.
Maryland man, right? Yeah, he was deported back to El Salvador, then he was brought back, and now it looks like he's going to be. It looks like now he's going to be deported to Eswatini, which was formerly Swaziland in southern Africa. So, and again, this has been another case where there has been questions on due process of law. Everyone in the United States is afforded some due process of law, right? Which is to say that even if someone is here illegally, you can't murder them, right? Like they go some due process of law, but there are different categories, and crossing over into the United States illegal is one of those categories where due process looks very different than it would for someone that was here on legal status or someone that was here as a U.S. citizen. But regardless, there's been a lot of questions on whether or not Trump designating certain organizations as terrorists or certain activities as being related to terrorism in order to use certain presidential authorities, which date all the way back in some cases to the 18th century, whether or not that's appropriate.
There is a question, if I can ask it,
sure,
because it's very relevant to this section. Jacob said, in your military experience, can the U.S. military conduct a strike without sufficient evidence?
Yes. The question is under what
is it
context?
Sufficient? I think the question would be, what is sufficient evidence?
Yeah, the question
because
is,
you can.
Let me answer the question. So it depends. Like if we're at war, and by the way, you can be at war without declaring war, as the United States government has proven for about the last 70 years. Sufficient evidence to launch a strike. It's like, well, yeah, you can engage in offensive operations based off of what you believe is sufficient evidence. It doesn't have to reach. It doesn't have the legal threshold is very, very different when the United States military is operating in an international environment as opposed to when you're operating within a domestic environment. And so we can certainly debate on whether or not certain military actions are legally justified, whether or not they should take place at all. But the idea of, can the United States military engage in an operation for what might be considered insufficient evidence in a U.S. domestic legal proceeding? Absolutely. We're not bound by the same laws. But again, I don't know if that's speaking directly to what, maybe he'll clarify if he wants something a little bit more. But obviously we have very different laws for how we engage in operations internationally versus domestically.
Well, and there's the question of, he said due process. So there is the idea that you're on international waters, you're not on American soil. Due processes.
Well, there's
a little bit
we're going to get to
different.
that because
so we're getting to all of this, but suffice to say that whenever this term due process comes up, there's due process for American citizens. There's due process for people that are in the country, potentially illegally or legally and not U.S. citizens. There's due process in accordance with U.S. law. There's due process in accordance with treaties that we've signed. There's due process in accordance with standard procedures or rules of land warfare that we conduct. So all of these things can factor in, and that's part of what we're going to discuss is whether or not Trump has crossed any lines on this. And that's probably a perfect place to kind of roll into the next portion of this, and that's the different perspectives that we're going to look at here. So again, just so everyone's on the same sheet of music with the framing of this, we're taking these three categories. Trump using the National Guard within cities, ostensibly to fight crime or to fight insurrections. We're going to talk about his immigration policy and his policies for deportation, right? And then we're talking about direct military strikes against cartels and drug traffickers. And, again, there's no question that a lot of what he's doing is unprecedented within recent times, right? So we're not debating that. We're debating whether or not it's appropriate and what are the various. So this next stage is us just looking at what's the left's arguments, what are the libertarian arguments, what are maybe your more traditional conservative arguments, and what we might consider the post-liberal arguments. And when we say post-liberal, we're talking about, a lot of the movements. Yeah, Christian probably categorizes himself as that, Carl Benjamin and some others. Aaron McIntyre, would you say?
I don't know if he would use the term.
I don't know if Aaron would. I don't know if he'd use the term, but this idea of kind of, we'll just...
I mean, Adrian Vermeule at Harvard would potentially maybe call himself that. I know that he would call himself a traditionalist. He's like one of the only right-wing guys left at Harvard.
Yeah.
Patrick Deneen
would
call himself
we'll just
that.
say kind of in general, the people that are really challenging kind of the classical liberal tradition and narrative.
J.D. Vance might potentially call himself that.
I don't know that he calls himself
He's used the phrase to describe himself at NatCon before.
Okay.
I mean, he might not like fully embrace everything that it entails, but he has used at least loosely the phrase to call himself that.
All right. Well,
so the left-wing perspective on this.
Well, before we get into those perspectives, I do want to discuss one thing that I think should be agreed upon across all perspectives, and that is that True Classic makes an excellent product. That's right. In fact, I'm actually sporting one of the True Classic button-down long sleeve shirts, and you can tell I like it because I don't typically like wearing long sleeve button-down shirts, but True Classic, as always, fits just incredibly well. It's very comfortable. And like I said, the whole thing that turned me on to True Classic, it wasn't me, ladies and gentlemen. My wife is the one that found True Classic and said, "Baby, I think you'd look good in these things." And let's face it, guys. If our wives think we look good in it, then we do. That's it. The discussion is over. And so I'm telling you right now, you can get True Classic. It used to be that you could only get it online, and you can still get it at trueclassic.com/Nick. And you should definitely check out the bundles that they make available with that. Not to mention the fact that when you do trueclassic.com/Nick, they know that, hey, we sent you, and that's a good thing for us. So try that out. But they've also got it at stores like Target and Costco now. And well, let's face it, I do a lot of shopping at the Costco's. It used to be where I got most of my clothes, and then I stopped because I went to True Classic, and lo and behold, True Classic is now at Costco. Once again, making my life very easy. So go check out trueclassic.com/Nick. Like I said, I love their button downs. I love their t-shirts. Also check out their fitness. Their fitness gear is great. I'm getting Christian some because we're going back to the gym. Okay.
He thinks. All
right. So let's go and get on the first perspective here. Let's take the left first. So, I mean, Ezra Klein is obviously, he thinks that all of this is, he describes it as authoritarian. We've heard it described as fascistic, but to some degree, we hear this all the time from the left, right? The left thought Mitt Romney was a fascist, right?
Yeah.
And so but if we're being fair to the left, what's their argument?
So there's actually a couple things in Klein's piece that actually point directly to the three issues that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
And I mean, you brought this up earlier. Like, there's a variety of issues we could have talked about. We intentionally wanted to focus on these because they're in the news, they're hot button issues, and there's a variety of perspectives. Well,
They're
on
ongoing.
that front, Klein, he's giving all these examples of what he sees as authoritarian actions taken by the president that's kind of breaking the system. I mean, to go back to the title up here, right, about stop acting like this is normal. He's using as examples things that he thinks is not normal. Well, one case study that he gives is the National Guard itself. He says, calling up the National Guard on thinnest of pretexts, that's a preliminary,
He talks about the ones before. Well, so let's take the National Guard being called up for the cities. So this is one where you see some common concern by both the left and libertarians, where it's this idea that, look, we have a long-standing tradition in the United States that we don't use the military for policing operations, right? It is one thing when essentially maybe a city or a state has gotten to a point where they are calling in, like the first line is usually the governor calling up the National Guard in order to augment your police forces to deal with a riot or things of that nature. What happened with the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles in was that the early 90s?
1992, I believe.
Was so significant that additional resources were required. But in most of these cases, what you have is a mayor, a governor, all asking the federal government to come in and assist. Now, with some of the recent issues in Southern California, you had something different where they are obviously opposing Trump because of they oppose his immigration policies. And so, they were pushing back against it. But this idea, but even in Southern California, you could see where people were actively interfering with the federal government carrying out its legitimate responsibilities.
That's maybe what conservatives would argue. But from the left's perspective on this, I mean, Klein's very clear. So, for example, he gives he elaborates on this and says, we've watched Trump deploy the National Guard to Los Angeles and then to Washington, with more cities expected to come under federal military occupation soon. So that's referring to Chicago. I've got the news article up here that you hinted at where, he's saying like, I didn't say whim. He's basically saying we're going to go into Chicago.
Yeah.
It's not up for debate from Trump's perspective. So, Klein, then ties that into the immigration issue, which is the other one that we were talking about, right? We've watched masked ICE agents conduct raids all over the country, refusing to reveal badge numbers or warrants. And I mean, he just keeps going here. And then he concludes with, this is not just how authoritarianism happens. This is authoritarianism happening, is his argument. So what he's trying to say here is, you can look at the National Guard situation, and Trump is basically taking over blue cities in largely blue states. This is something else that Gavin Newsom's also talked about. He's like, well, the crime rate in Louisiana is substantially higher than the crime rate in California. Why isn't Trump deploying the National Guard to Louisiana? He keeps putting out, his press office is putting out all of these tweets of like, the murder rate in Memphis and in St. Louis is substantially higher than in Los Angeles. Why is Trump deploying the National Guard to Los Angeles? The governor of Illinois, Pritzker, is also doing the same thing now. He's pointing out that like Chicago's not in the top 10 most dangerous cities. It's all these like red states that have these. He'll still admit they're blue cities, but he's saying they're all in these red states. Trump's not deploying the National Guard there. And to that, the response, that you're seeing from other people on the right is, well, I think Trump should send it in there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to jump too far into that though, because that's other perspectives. But from the left-wing perspective on the National Guard front, they're actually arguing it ties directly into the immigration thing, because they're saying that the government is going into these communities, deploying the military or federalizing the National Guard, and they're taking over these cities and basically nationalizing them, and that this is super dangerous. Again, this is, in their phrase, this is not normal.
No, I think, and for the left to say it's not normal is accurate. It isn't normal. Like, this has never happened before in my lifetime. We'll get to later on, whether or not it's warranted, but it's true that it's not normal. It's true that it's unprecedented. And again, if we're being fair to the left, to your point, it's like, okay, Memphis, St. Louis, why are you just picking on blue cities in blue states? Why aren't you going after the cities in red states as well? And more than that, like let's set aside the immigration for a moment, because in Los Angeles, I think the immigration argument, because here's what needs to be understood. It's not that Trump, federalized Los Angeles in order to carry out immigration law. No, the federal government was fulfilling its, now, maybe he didn't like the way they did it. He talked about masks and no warrants or badge numbers. Maybe you don't like the fact that they were so aggressive. Maybe you don't like all that. Fine. But nobody's debating whether or not immigration is the responsibility of federal law enforcement. In fact, that's one of the primary arguments the left has used to not participate in enforcing immigration law, is that it's federal law, not state or local, and so we don't have any obligation. It was when the people of the city of Los Angeles, or not the people, but a lot of people within Los Angeles started obstructing, getting violent, showing up ICE detention centers, showing up ICE stations, and started engaging in violent activity. It went way beyond just peaceful protesting, right? And then you actually had an incident where you had a member of the Los Angeles City Council essentially asking the LAPD police chief, what is more we can do to inform people of when ICE is doing X, Y, and Z? And the police chief is sitting there trying to respectfully go, well, ma'am, we're not allowed to obstruct federal law, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that in Los Angeles, you might be able to push back on the left and say, look, you started it, right? They went in to enforce immigration law. They didn't bring in the guard. They didn't bring in the military. This was the response. You didn't deal with the response effectively. And so additional resources were needed in order to maintain order to allow the federal government to carry out its legitimate function. But if you want to put them in the best possible light, the left's arguing this, okay, great. What's your excuse for Chicago? Right? And if you're going to say, well, it's the murder rate, they don't like what he did in DC, but they can at least admit that, yeah, the Constitution does give him authority to do that. They'll complain about it. They say they don't like it. They'll say it's looming fascism, but they will at least acknowledge that it is constitutional. But Chicago, is there an insurrection in Chicago right now? And if there is an insurrection, and we can all agree that, okay, maybe that's a subjective term, the mayor doesn't recognize an insurrection. The governor doesn't recognize an insurrection. So the argument is, well, the people of Chicago, their representatives, the people of Illinois, their representatives are not acknowledging that there's any sort of insurrection that would require federal intervention. So why are you doing this? And if your argument is it's because of crime, well, then why aren't you doing it in Memphis and in New Orleans? And, again, that's their overall argument when it comes to deploying of the National Guard. When it comes to immigration policy, their big thing has been, well, it's not a crime to be in the United States illegally. And it's well, wait a second. It's not a crime. It's a civil statute that you're violating. And what they're failing to recognize is that, well, that depends. If you overstay your visa, that's one thing. If you were brought into the country, if you cross the border illegally, well, no, that is criminal. It isn't just civil. And the other thing too that I think is when the left is arguing about this is they're saying, well, they're not being afforded due process. And the reason why they're making this argument is they're saying that, well, it's not like Trump is arresting these people, giving them their day in court, proving that they're here illegally, and then deporting them. He's just arresting them and deporting them. They don't feel like sufficient due process is being used. And so their argument is that, well, what's going to end up happening is you're either going to deport people that, lo and behold, turns out they're here legally, or there's some other extenuating circumstance. And it's a far too aggressive. This is where you get the Maryland man. But the problem was we won't get into that yet. So that's the left's opposition there, is that essentially what's going to end up happening is because you are being so aggressive in enforcement of immigration policy that you're not showing warrants, you're using masks, which is outside of the norm with respect to law enforcement in the United States. You're covering up badge numbers, which makes it harder to keep law enforcement accountable. And again, they're not wrong that some of this is unprecedented. The question is it's legal, right? Mm-hmm. Is he still operating within the boundaries of the law? And then I think the third component has to do with the strikes on the cartels, using the military to aggressively target and, in fact, eliminate cartel members. And the most obvious depiction of this right now has been, again, the speedboat that was allegedly transporting drugs that was taken out.
And there's always this element of that the left starts harping on, which they're harping on now, is, oh, well, those weren't like kingpins. Those were low-level drug runners. And why are we doing this to these low-level people? And that's
I've heard
one
some of them say they might have been refugees.
Right.
Well, the argument, their first argument was, how do you know they are who they are?
Yeah.
Or how do you know they are who the government is telling us they are? Right. And so the left's argument, and the left's, and look, give the left credit for the sort of argument they're making. The argument they're making is, wait a second, you guys don't trust the government. You guys think the government always gets it wrong. You guys think the government is incompetent. And yet you're going to allow that same government to start blowing up, speedboats in the Caribbean that they tell you are transporting drugs.
I mean, that's the reason why I was chuckling when I was like, these guys might be refugees, because nobody buys that. Nobody buys the idea that refugees are going to be boarding a boat with 4 motors.
You're wrong. You're wrong.
At 2
Because
o'clock in
the
the morning.
left does
Yeah,
buy it. That's the thing, is the left really does buy it, though. I don't think the left has the perspective they have because they're like sitting here scheming and trying to deceive people. I think they really believe what their side is
If I was
saying.
going to give the best argument I could for the left on this one, because the left does have a great deal of again, whenever a crime is committed, we've seen this with everything in Charlotte recently. Like, there's always this knee-jerk reaction to, how did society fail the criminal? And so for the left, they will look at something like that and be like, okay, well, you didn't take out a drug kingpin. You might have taken out somebody that lives in an environment in Venezuela to where if they don't work for the cartel, their family gets murdered. And so you just killed the breadwinner for that family. And yeah, you might not like what he's doing, but he might not have any other choice, right? That's the left-wing argument. So again, I would say that across all those three, that's kind of the left-wing perspective, that either Trump is directly violating the Constitution, or he's so aggressively enforcing federal law that people are getting lost in the mix because he's not carefully following due process. Or in the case of the military strikes, they're probably going to be arguing that, one, this is a criminal issue, not a national defense issue, and that you're violating international law, and that once again you're creating conditions where now the federal government is going to be blowing up, random boats or killing people, and in the end, the people that are going to get killed are not, Pablo Escobar. The person that's going to get killed is the guy that has a wife and 3 kids and is only working for the cartels because he was forced to. Right? That's kind of the left-wing perspective, I would say, on those 3 issues, if I was putting it in the best possible light. Any disagreement on that?
No, I agree.
Now let's go into the libertarian argument. The libertarian arguments, I would say, are they haven't been as pronounced on some of the immigration. And when we say the libertarian arguments,
it depends on the libertarian.
You can always find libertarian. You have open borders libertarians, right? I think there's a
split
gentleman from Cato that's
between the Cato Institute types who are definitely open borders.
Yeah.
You look at like some of their advisors, some of the stuff that they say on Twitter or in congressional hearings, they're upfront about it. They support open borders.
Well, so the philosophical argument for this, right? And again, for everyone watching, we are giving the perspectives and we're trying to faithfully convey the perspectives of these different groups. It's not necessarily our perspective. I want to make sure
No, you'll hear that at the end.
That.
You'll hear that
at the end. We'll give you our perspective at the end. But the libertarians who argue in favor of kind of open borders, it's this concept of the free flow of goods and the free flow of people. It's the idea that property rights are something that individuals own, or individuals in concert with one another own. But governments, borders, things like that, they may be legal jurisdictions, but there's
a divide here. There's a side of libertarianism is a very, and I got to stress this because I have a lot of haters on Twitter that are upset at how often I'm criticizing libertarianism. But every now and then, I don't do it this often because, quite frankly, I feel like that we're just in an age where you're expected to caveat everything, and I'm done caveating things. I just want to call a spade. But I will, in this case, caveat something. There is a divide within libertarianism. You have an element of libertarianism that is explicitly pro-open borders. These are the Cato Institute types. These are usually the Reason Magazine types. It's the Project Liberal types who they've gone totally off the board. I mean, they supported Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
And then you have the Libertarian Party itself. So like Chase Oliver, who was their nominee for president last year, he's explicitly pro-open borders.
Yeah.
I mean, he tweets these memes all the time. He's like, this is not your property. And it's at the United States. And he's like, this is your property. It's just a house.
Yeah.
And so he's stressing that like anybody should be able to move into the United States because nobody has the right to close off that border because it's not a property rights
argument. The Chase Oliver argument is the quote unquote illegal immigrant can't move into your house, but he should be able to move into an area.
Especially if somebody's inviting them in to do work.
Yeah, the government
right?
doesn't own property.
If a business is inviting the illegal immigrants in to work in the factory or whatever.
But then you
what's
also
the perspective on national, like a sovereignty?
Well, this is the flip side of the libertarian.
Yeah.
So I said there was a divide within libertarians. The other side are the bordertarians or the Hoppians or the you can't have open borders in a welfare state type libertarians. Those are three different groups that all fall within the libertarian label. They might even disagree with each other, but they do agree that for a variety of reasons. Some of them think that no, nations are collections of property owners that are exercising almost like an HOA agreement.
Yeah.
Where the nation does have the right to determine who gets to come in and out. And they're actually trying to use libertarian logic. Other libertarians disagree with them, of course, but they're trying to use libertarian logic to argue in favor of borders. Those are the bordertarians. You get the same thing with the Hoppians, where they talk about the intentional community.
Yeah.
And the famous line that some might need to be physically removed from the polis if they don't agree to the rules of it. And then you have the Milton Friedman, you can't have open borders in a welfare state.
You have kind of like you have almost kind of like the anarcho-capitalist version of the libertarians, kind of more like the Rothbardians, the Murray Rothbard and whatnot, where, again, it's just free flow of goods, free flow of people. Property rights are something that belong to individuals. It's not something really that governments enforce property rights on behalf of individuals, but this idea of international borders is, we'll just say, somewhat problematic. But then other people that are generally associated with libertarian thought, like within government, so like Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, and then again, going back on the academic side, Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell sometimes is considered on more of the libertarian side. None of these guys are arguing for no borders or open borders or anything like that. So there is a divide within libertarianism when it comes to immigration. Now, I will say this: when it comes to some of these other issues,
there's not as much of it.
There's not as much that when it comes to the National Guard going into these cities, the libertarian concern. So again, the left seems to be more concerned about how federal power is being used against them. The libertarian argument is generally more federal power being used, right? So the libertarian argument is not as concerned with this whole what they might call right versus left argument on how it is. The libertarian argument is this is a dangerous precedent. We have certain, like the whole American tradition is built upon this idea of how do we constrain power? How do we provide centralization of power? This is why libertarians are big advocates. Insofar as libertarians support some level of government, they're very, very big on constrained government, limiting government power, separation of powers, different jurisdictions. And so even if like, let's say you had a libertarian that said, I agree that Chicago has a huge crime problem. I agree that the federal government could deploy the National Guard and potentially help alleviate that crime problem. But it's not the federal government's job to do that in this case. And the precedent that is set by the federal government doing it is actually worse than the crime problem in Chicago. And the argument, I don't say slippery slope as a pejorative, right? I think most of us will say that we're tired of people saying that there's no such thing as a slippery slope.
It's not a fallacy.
Yes, there are. There are slippery slopes. One thing can naturally lead to another. So the libertarian argument is like, fine, you don't mind when Trump's doing it to Chicago in order to, to stop murders or to enforce immigration law. I bet you'll mind it when Kamala Harris does it in, Raleigh, North Carolina to confiscate your guns. That's the libertarian argument for why we should be very, very cautious about allowing the federal government. And that's why I think a lot of libertarians are coming out and saying like, look, I can't support this. It's not because I don't think, the left is arguing that, the crime in Chicago is not so bad, right? Libertarians are like, no, it is bad and it is a problem. But the way our country works is that is a problem Chicago has to deal with. If Chicago can't deal with it through its elected representatives and police force, they can appeal to the governor of Illinois, and the governor can apply different resources. If they finally get to a point where none of them feel like they can put down a legitimate insurrection, okay, then there is a constitutional process for the federal government to intervene. But it's not because of a high murder rate. It's because of an uncontrollable insurrection that can't be done with sufficient local and state resources.
They're also
would you say that's a good libertarian argument?
I think that they're also worried about the militarization of the police. You saw this in the 2010s. This was a big libertarian issue, and it hasn't really gone away. The idea that the police are now using military-style vehicles or equipment or gear, and they're going into cities, and they're trying to harken back to, well, the crisis of the Roman Republic, where the military was used on Romans, but also some of the founding fathers warning about, standing armies being antithetical to preserving liberty. I mean, Jefferson famously didn't want a standing army at all in the United States because he thought that it would be used for basically and
it's important to remember that, like, when we had the Civil War, the vast majority of the units that made up the federal army were state militias. It wasn't federal troops in the sense that it was part of the regular army. They were state militias. And the founders, because of their concern over what they considered to be mercenaries, because their concern over standing armies and enticing governments to go to war when war might not have otherwise been necessary, they were very much opposed to it. And so that libertarian tradition, it's not floating out there in just mere philosophy, right? It is rooted in something that was right there at the founding and were beliefs that were held by founding fathers that we all respect. So again, I want to argue the libertarian position or express the libertarian position in a way that I think is honest to the arguments they're trying to make, not just the caricatures of those arguments.
Now, the last point on the libertarian front is with the war on drugs. So obviously, libertarians not a big fan of the war on drugs in general. So that's already an issue. But then there's a further issue, which is kind of the due process issue. It's the drone strike issue. Rand Paul was famous for this during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
He's talked about this, that 10 years ago or 12 years ago or 15 years ago, I was standing up on the Senate floor railing against Obama droning, using drone strikes, and sometimes against American citizens that were accused of being like supporters of Al-Qaeda or Islamic terrorist groups. Well, Rand has now latched on to the Venezuela case.
Yeah.
So J.D. Vance...
This was specifically, we're addressing the case of the speedboat that, again, the government released a video of a speedboat that they said was carrying drugs being basically blown up. And J.D. Vance, scroll up a little bit.
J.D. Vance
said, killing cartel members who poison our fellow citizens is the highest and best use of the military. And then somebody responded with, I forget who it was. It was
like one of the Krasensteins.
He basically said something to the tune of, this was criminal. Like, we don't know that this actually was who you say it was. This is criminal, not military. And J.D. Vance basically flippantly said, I don't give an SHI, right? I don't give
what you call it.
What you call it. And Rand Paul responded with, J.D., quote, I don't give a whatever. Vance says killing people who he accuses of a crime is the highest and best use of the military. Did he ever read To Kill a Mockingbird? Did he ever wonder what might happen if the accused were immediately executed without trial or representation? What a despicable and thoughtless sentiment it is to glorify killing someone without a trial. So Rand said this, and he had 148,000 likes, 36,000 comments.
Not all of them were friendly.
Yeah, and
I'd say most of them were not.
But this goes back to, okay, so if you look at and at a lot of the people we talk about, I can't claim to know them personally. Senator Paul, I can. I've done interviews with Senator Paul. I've campaigned with Senator Paul. He's always been supportive of me when I ran for office. I don't just consider Senator Rand Paul to be a good senator. I consider him to be a good man. I consider him to be a principled one. So I want to say this right off the bat. And this is the argument that he's making. And if you look at the kind of the examples he's using, is he's basically putting into this in the context of, typically speaking, we have treated drug crimes as crimes, not national defense. Now, that's not to say there's no precedent for it, but that's typically how it's been done. And what Senator Paul goes on to explain in follow-on tweets is, once again, you are allowing the federal government to kill people because the federal government has claimed that they are committing a crime. And that's a very, very dangerous precedent, to allow the federal government to say you're committing a crime and then to kill you. Now, he's not claiming that, Trump is doing this in downtown DC, right? This was done in international waters, but he's still bringing up that this is a problem. And again, the libertarian argument would typically go something like this. You don't mind when your side is doing it against a target that you feel is legitimate. How will you feel when the federal government is doing it against a target that you don't consider to be legitimate? At that point, you're going to come back and say, this is a violation of due process of law. You are exceeding your jurisdiction. And that's what Rand's doing. Rand is saying, I want to be intellectually consistent for how I have always viewed these things. So whether you like what he had to say or not, I do think it's fair to say that Senator Paul has been very consistent in this. And so he views this as being problematic. And I think you would find probably wide agreement within most libertarians that they consider this exercise of federal power and combating the cartels in this manner as being a slippery slope toward future administrations being able to use the federal government against other targets that they now consider to be legitimate. One of the things that you will find with a lot of libertarian arguments is they are always very, very concerned that a long-term precedent is being set by an action. And this goes into the third category here that we're going to talk about, is kind of your more traditional conservative argument. The way that I would distinguish between conservatives and libertarians on some of these issues is that both of them tend to appeal to the Constitution. Both of them tend to appeal toward limited government. Conservatives are generally more comfortable with a broader interpretation of federal power than libertarians. They're not as happy with the left-wing interpretation of what the government should do, but conservatives tend to have American conservatives still have a restrained view of government, but they offer more allowances when it comes for things like law and order, foreign policy,
drugs.
And they also,
libertarians tend to be very pro illicit drugs. Like they would love to legalize all of them. It's one of their biggest motivators for elections, right? To get people in. And so conservatives are very different from that. We tend to be very anti-drug. Now, you ended up with the war on drug era, which didn't do a good job. But now we're talking about Trump's version of war on drug, where we actually do use bombs on drug cartels. And I think most conservatives look at that and they're like, good. I think we're sick of them killing our people. We're sick of our own people being...
I think that the biggest difference is not just about documents and interpreting pieces of text like the Constitution, though, to differentiate between conservatives and libertarians.
No, I don't think that's the only difference.
I think that the biggest difference is more that libertarians are rooted in contract law, consent, voluntary association, individual sovereignty, and conservatives have a much higher emphasis that they place on things like tradition, inherited culture, social customs.
So the libertarians will often say that as long as you're an adult and it's consenting, the government shouldn't play a role.
Conservatives would not accept that.
And conservatives would not accept that. Conservatives would say we want a limited role for government, especially in activities which we consider to be, for lack of a better term, amoral or not of a significant threat to the body politic or to society in general.
Right,
But when it comes to drugs, when it comes to prostitution, when it comes to law and order, as well as when it comes to protecting things that they consider to be very important traditions for the country, beyond just like our system of government, like things like marriage, traditional marriage. These are things where conservatives have a whole category of traditions and institutions that they want legal protections for that libertarians typically do not. Would that be fair?
Right. And typically in an argument about what's going to be in your backyard, a conservative town would be up in arms and upset for a strip club coming in downtown, or a bunch of
and the libertarian will be buying shares in it.
And the libertarians would be like, why can't I bring my strip club here?
Well, can I want to say something very important here. there's a lot of libertarians who are also Christians who would say, I don't like the idea of you having a strip club.
Right.
But I don't
you
think-
have property rights and you can do what you want on
wait
your
a second,
property.
Wait a second. But the government should not be permitted to use violence against you to prevent it. Right? That's the libertarian argument. So the conservative argument is to say, well, look, we're not advocating just random use of violence against somebody that says that. What we're saying is that, or what a conservative argument would be is, they would agree with the libertarians that there are certain things that fall outside of the federal jurisdiction, but then it's the state jurisdiction. And then they would say, okay, there's certain things that fall out of the state jurisdiction and should be reserved for the locality and then reserved to the individual, the family, the church, whatever. But the difference is that from what I've seen, most libertarians will say if the federal government shouldn't be doing it, then the state shouldn't be doing it, then the board of supervisors shouldn't be doing it. Whereas the conservative allows for more intervention closer to the people. So the conservative says, yes, I don't want the federal government doing that, but it's okay for the states.
On that front, that's actually really important because there's a bit of overlap. We were talking about differences.
Yes.
There's actually a bit of overlap between the conservative position on these three issues and the libertarian position, insofar as a lot of conservatives would look at the ICE deportations. They would look at the crackdown on drugs, and they would look at the sending the National Guard into cities. And they would support a lot of that, maybe even all of it. But at the same time, conservatives would also grant, in many cases, the libertarian slippery slope argument and say, I actually share your concern, fellow libertarian. We might disagree on some of the morality stuff and drugs versus, illegal immigration. But I do share the concern about encroaching federal power. I do share the concern about due process. I do share the concern about federalizing everything or consolidating everything in Washington, D.C., even if I agree that we need more deportations, that we need law and order, that we need to crack down on some of the progressive nonsense.
Well, I think,
and so it's support for a lot of what Trump is doing while also granting concern.
Right. And so like an example of that would be, now I know some conservatives who were all about Trump's deportation efforts, rounding up criminals and sending them wherever they came from. But some of those very same people who wanted that got very upset when it looked like it was happening to nonviolent family type people, where it's like, this is not what I voted for. I actually saw that one of my most staunch conservative people that I interact with said that. She's like, I did not vote for that. And so that's where you get the difference. You've got libertarians who, nope, we really should have the borders be open. And you've got conservatives who they want limitations on who can come over and what activities they engage in here. We want criminals deported, things like that. And then you've got another category of people we'll be talking about in a minute.
Well, I think again, for the conservatives, I think what it comes down to is when it comes down to immigration, they're largely been supportive. The pushback that a traditional, a conservative argument to like when the left says, oh, ICE is wearing masks and they won't show their badge numbers. The conservative says, yeah, that's because you keep doxing these people.
Exactly.
And then your supporters will go and harass their kids at their school.
Yeah.
So for the conservative,
they're not worried about that argument.
No, that's what I'm
that
saying.
left-wing argument, they don't grant it.
Well, and it's the same reason why conservatives will say, well, it's not that hard not to break the law.
Here's what I think happens. The libertarian argument is very, very rooted in sticking to principle, like all the way through. And it's because they believe that's part of their moral framework. If you don't stick by the principle ceases to exist. The conservative argument tends to be a little bit more malleable in the sense that, yes, I don't generally want the police to wear a mask. I don't generally want them to do these things. But you've created conditions to where now these things are necessary. And so the conservative is willing to give a little bit of rope and say, okay, we're going to allow for this because of these unique conditions. But that doesn't mean they're okay with the process. And I think you see the same thing with immigration law. Like, yes, they want the federal government to be active. Yes, they want state and local law enforcement to assist, but they also want prioritization where they think it really belongs. And where they think it really belongs is with people that, like, for instance, if someone was brought over here when they were 2 years old and they've lived here for 20 years and now they're married and they've got 2 kids, they don't want that person prioritized for deportation, right? They want there to be some sort of acknowledgement that this situation is very different from another one. Regardless of what we might think, that's the argument. Now, when it comes to the National Guard into cities, this one gets a little more tricky. When it was DC, conservatives had really no problem with that because it fit very neatly into the Constitution. When it comes to places like Chicago, there's a little bit more hesitation. I don't think conservatives are at a point where their answer is absolutely not under no conditions. I think what they're saying is okay, we get it, but this is a little bit more.
What's your constitutional justification for doing so? Because we need to see constitutional justification.
We need to see constitutional justification. It's not that they don't acknowledge a problem there, but the Russell Kirk conservative will look at that and say, okay, I could see how this could go wrong. Now, again, you might be able to say that the conditions are so unique that we're willing to allow something that is unprecedented, but we can find a sufficient constitutional loophole to justify it, right? I think that's kind of the conservative position. Now, when it comes to the third thing that we talked about, and that is the militarization, like using the military in direct action against the cartels, I think the vast majority of our conservatives are like, great idea.
Yep.
They might have some concerns with stuff on U.S. soil, but when it comes to that thing they look at that as, okay, what is did the U.S. government use due process in the sense that we met the legal thresholds for prosecuting a case within our own borders? No, but that wasn't in our own borders. So what was it? Trump had declared that particular organization a terrorist organization. They were operating in international waters. Trump said, terrorist organization bringing drugs to my country. I feel like the intelligence is sufficient. Go ahead and strike it. I think the vast majority of conservatives are going to be like, not a problem.
Well, and that one of the issues there is just like conservatives tend to be a little bit more choosy on which people they want prioritized for deportation, they also are choosy with who do we prosecute for drug crimes? Do we prosecute every random drug user, or do we prosecute the people that are providing those drugs to the drug user? And what do we do about these outside entities who are sending it, into our country? And so we're definitely conservatives have a very strong sense of these people are the villain and they're the ones we should be targeting. And conservatives tend to look at drug users as more as victims of the activity. And I think maybe not as much as like the leftists do. But conservatives do, many conservatives they vilify drug cartels and things like that, as they should, of course, because they have some personal vendetta against them because of someone they know who was a victim of it. That is a perfect example of what we have with J.D. Vance. One of the reasons J.D. Vance is so, and I think Rand maybe forgets this sometimes because Rand tends to be a little bit of a curmudgeon. He takes all of sort of human reasoning for why they're so passionate about this issue out of it, and it's just very cut and dry, which there's a case to be made for that, looking at it in that way. However, you forget that you're talking to J.D. Vance, whose mother was, she almost lost her battle with drugs over and over again because of some of these type of things that were being brought into our country. And he saw the humanity side of his mother, whether she made those choices herself or not. She was still a victim of this horrible thing that was brought into our country. And so J.D. Vance has a vendetta against these people, and it's personal. Well, I mean, and so a lot of people, as conservatives, it's a personal vendetta because every single one of us knows somebody.
Well, I think for conservatives too, the left and the libertarians tend to look at this as like a commodity thing. Drugs are being sold. Why are drugs being sold? Because people want them. And that's not incorrect, right?
Mhm.
That is not an incorrect assessment. There's a lot of other things within the drug trade where they prey on children, they prey on vulnerable people. The other thing too, from the conservative side, is the conservatives associate drugs with cartels and with international actors like China flooding our streets with fentanyl, where they don't just see drugs as a criminal activity or a commodity transaction. They see it as part of a broader strategy to demoralize, disrupt, and kill Americans, right? So when conservatives make those connections between terrorist organizations, between adversarial governments, they see that this is very easily a national defense issue for them, not just a criminal justice issue. And I think that's another distinction between the way conservatives look at the drug trade and the way maybe a lot of people on the libertarians on the left look at the drug trade. The final category that we're going to go over is what we would call, again, kind of the post-liberal, or maybe we would say more the traditionalist. These are essentially people who it's a I don't want to say a relatively new movement, but it's gaining more prominence lately among people that are saying, look, we don't think that's good enough to just go back to 2003 or 1994 or 1982 or whatever date you have in your mind when everything was normal. They think that there's something fundamentally that needs to be addressed here. And a lot of people on the post-liberal side are not only saying, good job, Trump, they're saying, you're not going far enough.
Right.
So, Christian, this is an area we're both familiar with it, but you more so than me when it comes to the philosophy.
Yeah. So we've talked about three groups, and all three of these groups actually have something in common, which is they're criticizing Trump for going too far to varying degrees. Some are explicit about it, like the left.
Mm-hmm.
Some are more procedural about it, like the libertarians, and some are more cautious, even if they're supporting the end goal about it, like conservatives. Post-liberals are looking at this and saying, I'll critique Trump too. He's not going far enough. He's not doing enough. I'll critique him from the right, not the left. They'll look at, for example, Rand Paul's argument here and say, this is absurd because what you're insinuating first off, here's some examples. Let me just show you some of the replies here. 31,000 likes. Don't shoot till you see that they've had due process. Actually, you can't shoot down those Japanese fighter planes. They haven't even been given due process yet. He got ratioed really hard on this, right? And I'm not saying every single one of these people is a post-liberal, but the argument being, okay, so your concern is that we're not upholding the rule of law or due process. Whose law and who's ruling? Whose process? What constitutes the due process? Who gets to determine that due process? Who wrote the laws? Who's executing the law? Who's enforcing the law? Because progressives have been controlling all of that process. That talk about due process, they've been controlling the process the entire time. So when you're saying Trump hasn't done enough, what post-liberals are really saying is he has not done enough to dismantle the progressive system that we're all operating within.
Yeah.
And when we defend proceduralism, what we're really defending is a progressive hijacking of the system. Or if you go even further into post-liberalism, they would say a progressive fulfillment of the system. One or the other.
No, I think the post-liberal is one of the things that kind of distinguishes maybe someone that is post-liberal or doesn't describe themselves as conservative in like the American tradition, is they're just fed up. This is something where they look at it where it's like, I don't care. From their perspective, you could make a good enough constitutional argument for why Trump should not send in the National Guard to Chicago, and the conservative would say, yeah, I'm going to have to agree with you because the Constitution is sacred. The post-liberal more and more is like,
then the problem is with the Constitution.
If we're not allowed to use
That's not to say that
power-
they grant the argument that the Constitution prohibits it, but they're saying if it did, then the problem is with the document,
the post-liberal,
not the action.
The post-liberal would say, well, I don't care then because it has to be done. Because I think one of the things that defines a lot of the post-liberal movement is it's absolute disgust with wokeism to a degree where it's like, I just want to defeat that. What do you need to do to defeat it? And it's like, well, we need to do this. Okay, do it. Well, but there's this procedure. Nope. They hijacked this is their argument. They've hijacked the procedure. They've hijacked it for decades. They've used it against us. they don't consistently apply it. So it no longer is going to govern the way I think about these things. And that's where I think a lot of people within the post-liberal mindset have this idea of, no, the process betrayed me. I have to use something outside the process now in order to deal with these problems.
Well, wouldn't there also be an element of, if you look at the libertarian ideal and everything was set up with their ideal, with their open borders, with their with legalizing all the drugs and legalizing, prostitution and some of these things that are really like the sacred cows of the libertarian movement. I mean, they, for some reason, are really, really huge on criminal justice reform and let's make sure that all of these criminals have all these rights. And so part of the critique, it seems like to me, that a post-liberal would have is, even if you got everything you want, we would be living in a hellscape with all of that crap. So we do have to have some guardrails. We do have to have things that are acceptable in our society and things that are not acceptable in our society, right?
They disagree with the means and the ends, because they would say that the post-liberal would look at certainly the left critique of Trump, but even large chunks of the libertarian critique of what Trump is doing and saying, no, I don't agree with your premise, because you're advocating for this system where we're all just kind of bundles of rights floating around, waiting, on the left perspective, waiting for the state to be taking actions to enable you to live your best life. That always entails confiscating people's assets to redistribute it to their preferred interest group. But even on the libertarian front, they would say, no, I don't want the libertarian utopia because there's no room for virtue. It's been crowded out by just the marketplace. And if the marketplace demands strip clubs on every corner or letting people shoot up on the streets in San Francisco, I'm not going to accept it. And then if you're going to appeal to, but this violates somebody's rights, I don't care about the rights. I utterly reject I mean, I use this phrase so often to the point that Andrea hates me for it, but like they utterly reject the metaphysics behind it, not just the end state. They reject the whole thing.
There's also the element of if they can have all of these things as long as the government doesn't pay for it, the libertarian idea is that, well, you do whatever you want, just don't make me pay for it.
Yeah.
The problem, and I think the post-liberals have latched onto this, is you're going to pay for it either way. So if I've got to pay for stuff that's happening here, there's no way you can stop paying for everything we're paying for. That's never going to happen. So as long as we're paying for all of this, we're going to go ahead and restrict it.
Well, I think there's... wait a second. I want to interject here. You said something before that I think is really important here. And that is one of the things with the more classical liberal tradition and the conservative view and the libertarian view as well, is its respect for the process, because the process is in and of itself an end state, right? Protecting the process is very, very important to both conservatives and libertarians. The post-liberal, I think, is more concerned with, and again, I'm trying to give this argument as best I can. They're looking at it as, if the process doesn't yield the results I want, the process is wrong. And so change the process because I want that result. Now, again, the fight between the conservatives is they're like, well, changing the process doesn't necessarily get you the result, and it can get you something worse. But I think a lot of the post-liberal arguments at this point, especially as they look at all three of those things, is it's like, well, no, you shouldn't just, you shouldn't just have strict immigration policy, be going after everyone out here. You should be shutting down the borders and stopping immigration, right? Not all post-liberals, but you get the point, right? When it comes to deploying the National Guard to blue cities, it's like, yeah, why not?
And send them to the blue cities and red states.
Yeah, and send them to the blue cities and red states because they clearly are not interested. One, and it's this argument too that like, fine, that city has demonstrated is that it doesn't know what's best for itself for the last 6 decades. So intervention is necessary. Oh, well. Right? When it comes to the cartels, it's like, oh yeah, why shouldn't you use your overwhelming military power to essentially strike fear in the hearts of all these cartels that are in some cases working with foreign governments to undermine us and go after them? Why wouldn't you? And so I think what they're looking at with a lot of this is when you look at the amount of power the United States has, economic and military, I think, and you look at a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, which are questions of law enforcement, which are questions of being willing to utilize the power that you have in order to achieve the end results that seem to make sense. Not doing it seems ridiculous to them.
I would say that a lot of post-liberals would look at this and say, I'm not going to take a position where the logical end consequence of the position is I lose. In the world that I want to live in, the type of society that I want to live in does not come about because my own principles prevents it from happening.
Yeah.
I want to live in a certain type of society that believes in a certain type of things, and I will do anything that's necessary, obviously to a point within, moral.
There's still a moral framework. Yeah.
Framework. But in order to achieve that end result. And so it gets back to the whole, if the rule brought you to this point, of what use is the rule? If the rule produces progressivism, then chuck the rule out and change the rules until it doesn't produce progressivism. Put it this way. I think that a lot of post-liberals would look at, say, what happens in San Francisco, and you have like naked people walking down the streets in San Francisco. You have homeless addicts that are shooting up on the sidewalk. And they would say, the reason these things happen is because the framework that San Francisco operates on, the modern liberal framework, the modern progressive framework that these societies operate on, like San Francisco, literally lacks the ability to say no to somebody doing this, to shooting up heroin on the sidewalk or walking down the street naked. They don't have the ability to tell these people no, and so they happen. Well, the reason for it is because liberalism in many respects is metaphysically neutral about individual actions. It's, well, if there's, something that's objectively true that also necessitates obligations on the individual, then we would require it of people, but then that kind of violates individual choice and, liberal conceptions of human rights. And so therefore we can't do it. We have to be neutral about these things. Post-liberals don't think that anything can be neutral, especially anything in the realm of politics or government. And so they say, in your quest for neutrality, you've stripped your ability within the government to say this is right and this is wrong, and we're not going to allow this and we will allow that. You might think that this is what protects, say, freedom of speech or freedom of association or property rights. But if it's taken to its logical conclusion, it actually protects the same principle that you're operating on that protects these things that I agree are good. Because it's not like post-liberals don't agree with property rights. But they would say the same principle that you're using to defend property rights. See, I just want to defend property rights because I think they're good. And the libertarian or the conservative might be defending it because it's part of the process. But the problem is that same process that you're appealing to defend property rights, if it's taken to its logical, absurd conclusion, defends progressive degeneracy. It'll defend.
That's their argument.
Aren't there now in the post-liberal idea? Would that, there's a mayor in California that wanted to set up a basically basically a drug smorgasbord for within a safe zone, and you can come in and you can do all of the drugs you want to do. They will even provide you with the needles. They'll provide you with all of the drugs you want, as much as you desire to consume, but there will be no Narcan. So
he's basically saying you have an opportunity.
You have an
we
opportunity.
will provide a space where you can come and do drugs, but if you die, you die. That's
exactly
what the mayor was. I don't know that that's.
Would you say that guy is post-liberal?
No,
that guy's more libertarian.
That's
except
more libertarian.
Libertarians don't want to pay for it, but this guy says we'll pay for it.
The post-liberals would not want the state to be promoting drug use, even if it's a whole, you do you and you just suffer the consequences, because their argument is no. I to quote Fossey on it, it's, I will not allow my fellow citizens to destroy themselves even if they wish it.
Yeah. Okay, so this guy basically wants them to just resolve the problem themselves by eliminating themselves. Now, does he fall into one of these categories or not really?
That's kind of more libertarian.
It's more libertarian, if anything. But so let's just recap this real quick, because now we're going to go into kind of our analysis on this. And there's two things we're going to analyze. One is kind of what arguments we're most sympathetic toward. And then also, is Trump going to be able to continue? Again, when we mentioned 4 categories, 2 of them generally supportive, 2 of them generally opposition. is Trump going to be able to continue to operate the way he is? And we're going to analyze what are the ways that he potentially could and what are the things that could potentially shut him down. So that's what we're going to analyze, along with kind of what arguments we find the most appealing. But if I could sum up with the post-liberal, and Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, the post-liberal approach, what differentiates the post-liberal from the conservative on this one is the conservative, like the libertarian, is still concerned about the process, still very concerned about the process, but is willing to give more leeway and believes in a more expansive role for imposing certain like traditions, institutions, rather than the libertarian does. The post-liberal says, no, I want to impose the traditions, I want to impose the law and order, and I think we should use the power that we have available to us to do so. That doesn't mean the post-liberal wants to live in a fascist state or a totalitarian dictatorship. It just means that they look at this as kind of a zero-sum game at this point between what we might call like woke elements and those that want to live in a more traditionalist society. And their attitude is one side's going to win, the other side isn't, and they are not willing to coexist with us, so we shouldn't coexist with them. Is that fair?
I wouldn't entirely agree with the whole we just need to impose everything, but I would certainly agree with the conclusion that you said there. That it's one side's going to win this thing.
So now we're going to get into the analysis phase, and this comes down to, I will tell you right now that I put myself pretty firmly in what we might call the kind of more the conservative camp. I've actually been pretty open to everything that Trump has been doing so far. I feel like he really has sought. I mean, even though you're referencing the Insurrection Act, you're representing the Alien and Sedition Act, which goes back to the first Adams administration. But it's also one of those things where I do feel like we are living in a unique environment, and so I'm still concerned. I am still concerned about the federal government doing certain things, but I also feel like I recognize the environment that we're in, and the bottom line is if the hands-off approach that I might generally prefer was working, we'd be in a better situation. The other thing too, that I kind of recognize along with the post-liberals is I look at woke progressivism, I look at communism, I even look at it, even though I believe in religious freedom, I look at what we might call Islamist, in the sense that using Islam not just as a religion that you practice, but as a form of government under Sharia. I look at all of these as completely incompatible with the United States. And so insofar as you are pushing those agendas, I don't feel like that's an agenda that peacefully coexists with, again, even my version of the United States, which is very open to allowing people to do, believe, practice all kinds of things that I disagree with, that I might find immoral, but recognizing that there's limitations with respect to what government power can institute. And so I generally believe in a high degree of individual liberty with a high degree of personal responsibility. By the same token, I find myself in a situation where I feel like people that are openly hostile toward my view of government have been running my government, at least running the bureaucracy, in many cases running these cities, in many cases running various states, and for a good portion of my life running the federal government. And so I'm looking at this where, look, there's a lot of work that needs to go into recognizing the nature of this threat that wokeism presents and being willing to do the things that are necessary in order to dislodge it and properly categorize it. This is not just another idea. This is not a Democrat arguing with me about how much we should spend on, a welfare program. This is a movement that is, again, if it's socialist, if it's woke, if it's, some of these other categories I mentioned, it is openly hostile to what my country was founded on, what it has been, and what I hope it still seeks to be. And so I will always be leery of the federal government engaging in operations which I feel are constitutionally questionable. And I'm not going to surrender on that. This is very important. This is why I don't consider myself a post-liberal. I feel like they are willing to go too far and to overthrow things which I think are still very important and valuable to us as a country. I think the Constitution and certain elements within that are essential to our identity as Americans, and I'm not willing to surrender on them. But I also, again, to the extent that Trump has, I think he has been within his boundaries within immigration. I think he is within his boundaries with respect to some of the actions he's looking at taking against these cartels. if it comes down to sending the National Guard to Chicago, I'm going to be watching that. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be watching that very, very closely because I don't feel comfortable with this idea that if a city has a crime problem, we can just federalize the military and send it in to take care of it. I do think that sets a dangerous precedent. I think you can make arguments to the fact that a lot of these cities have been allowed to essentially engage in semi-lawless behavior for far too long. Memphis, like I love Tennessee. I think Tennessee is an incredibly well-run state, but Memphis is an absolute joke. And I sometimes wonder why, anyways, and I'll leave it at that. But again, that kind of is an illustration of kind of my position.
To me, I feel very similarly to you, but I'm going to be really honest with everybody about, I know what is right and correct is to do what is constitutionally allowed. But there is a piece of me that when I see there is a gray area for me on this. And the reason there is because when we're seeing our own citizens getting targeted by criminals and they're not receiving justice, and we have people who are not safe to live in their own communities and be able to go places in their own communities, and the powers in that area have basically abandoned these victims. These are American citizens. And as Americans, we expect to be able to live our lives and the pursuit of happiness, right? The idea that we can't pursue happiness in this environment because some people have made it really bad. I do think there is an element of, okay, where can we receive help from then if we've been abandoned by our city leaders or we've been abandoned by our state leaders in these areas? At that point, who do these people turn to get justice if you're no longer able to receive justice? And so there's an element of let's get it cleaned up because these people have been abandoned by their state. They've been abandoned by their city. They care more now about the criminals and what we do with criminals than they do about the victims of those criminals' actions. And so there is a piece of me that thinks, no, this city has shirked its responsibility and somebody has got to save these people.
Christian.
So, on a lot of this stuff, I see people that are like, I brought this up earlier, like, we need to follow the rule of law. We need to follow the Constitution. We on the right were doing that. It was the left that broke these things. Quite frank, like, anybody who knows me in detail, like you guys do, knows what I believed in pre-COVID and post-COVID. The internet sees me as Christian, the reactionary post-liberal who hates liberalism and hates libertarianism, but they don't know that I'm also Christian, the formerly devout libertarian.
Uh-huh.
But it's hard for me to continue believing in a process that has just demonstrated its utter failure over and over again. I do not see how anybody can still identify as a libertarian after COVID and the BLM riots and the lockdowns. I think it's just an utter failure. It's not that the principles behind it are bad. It's not that individual liberty as a concept is the problem. The problem is when you enshrine certain axiomatic principles as the highest good itself, divorced of any other context, that you get progressivism. And so I look again, like, this case, we're not following the rule of law. Who wrote the rules? Whose law? I haven't been given an answer on this. I get the same thing with, well, we need to follow due process. That guy in Charlotte who stabbed that poor woman to death, he was given due process 14 times and let out of prison 14 times, or got out of going to prison 14 times.
Cashless bail.
14 times. Where was her due process? She got the knife is what she got. Now, somebody's going to listen to that, maybe James Lindsay, and say, Christian wants to get rid of due process. No, the problem is not the concept of due process, but the problem is the way that we've been applying a lot of these things. I'm not saying nobody should have due process. We should all just go into the streets and settle this thing the way the Wild West settled it. No, but you know what? There are some people out there that do need to get the Wild West treatment. People like that guy. So when I'm hearing appeals to process and procedure, I'm going to always ask, to what ends? What are the results that this is producing? And if the results are producing lawless animals going into cities, murdering people on public transport, I'm going to say, yeah, maybe we need to do something about that. And then the response is going to be, well, I also want to do something about it, but I'm worried about X, Y, and Z. The process is only as good as the end state that it produces. And if the end state is consistently producing degenerate progressive ends, something is wrong with your application of the process, or maybe even the process itself. I'm not willing to say, oh, the problem is just due process itself, therefore get rid of it. But I am absolutely going to say something is broken with our criminal justice system. Something is broken with our laws. Something is broken with who's applying them. Something is broken with our DAs, or in Virginia, we would call them Commonwealth attorneys.
When the due process basically creates so many loopholes and allows people to slip through the cracks, then the process isn't good anymore. You've got a situation where people are able to plea down. This guy that murdered this girl on the train had just gotten out on cashless bail.
Okay, real quick. The last thing that he got, what he got was, it was a notice to return, right? So he got out with nothing, because the last charge he had was misusing the 911 system. And it's because it looks like he was having a schizophrenic episode. Now, I think the magistrate should have looked at the long history of abuses and said, no, we're not going to treat you as someone that misused the 911 system in isolation from everything else you've done. The other thing I would say is, look, nothing is easier than looking at a flaw in a system or a miscarriage of justice and then defining the entire system by the miscarriage, right? By the injustice. By the same token, I look at the closing in on 250-year history of the United States, and I see a great deal of success. I see a number of times when our system has produced positive results. And so I am not willing to accept that the fundamental principles upon which we were built, or the systems or processes upon which they were established, are somehow the thing that is inherently flawed. Now, the thing that I do agree with both of you on is that I don't believe that process or that system can exist in a vacuum, in a moral vacuum. This is why I think that you have to view our system in the way it was originally created. Yes. And the way it was originally created was for what John Adams described as a moral and religious people, and totally unsuited to the government of any other. And there's been such a move to try to completely separate that theological component within our society, and to just allow the processes to operate in and of themselves. And I think that's been problematic. I think that experiment has failed.
There's a lot of people out there that I think are trying to claim their God-given rights at the same time that they're denying God, and at the same time that they're denying God-given responsibilities and obligations that come with those rights. I think Jordan Peterson gets a lot of flack nowadays, but Jordan Peterson was right when he was saying years ago that we've spent something like 60 years talking about rights and not responsibilities. There is far too much emphasis on what can I get out of the system? What does the state owe me? What does society owe me? I'm
agree.
A victim of whatever circumstances have been imposed upon me, and I need to be treated special. I need to be given X, Y, and Z. We have this never-ending, and you would agree with me on this, we have this never-ending list of the expansion of rights, women's rights, and LGBTQ rights, and immigrant rights, and workers' rights. And we have all this conversation about what everybody else is entitled to. And we've not been having this conversation about what's necessary to maintain civilization.
Right. And so I feel like none of us are denying that due process should be given. And that we have a right to due process. The question is, has that process been diluted so far that we no longer have justice to a degree that we're supposed to? So when we have basically the entire perspective of the criminal justice system has shifted off of making victims whole and onto coddling criminals. And so now the process is all about, let's make sure these criminals aren't too uncomfortable. Let's make sure these criminals feel heard, and let's go ahead and look at these criminals as victims as well. And so there is this shift in our society to now treat criminals like they too are victims of the system now. And so the due process no longer cares about the victims and what has been stolen from these victims, or lives stolen, property stolen, whatever it might be. They're not worrying about that. They're worrying about the criminal. And so I think the concern is less about, we shouldn't give these people due process. It is more about, we need to revisit what these processes actually do.
Well, and I want to say this because look, my dad, I've obviously been a state legislator for 10 years. My father was in law enforcement. He was LAPD for 20 years. My father fought incredible. Here's another reason why. And again, I don't mean to make it overly personal, but whenever I hear this, like, oh, none of this is working. I mean, I know you don't. I didn't
say none of this is working.
I know. But. Okay. It's been implied.
Okay.
The point that I'm making is that there are a lot of people working very, very hard, putting themselves at risk to try to make this process work. And there's no question that a lot of their efforts are being subverted. This is not something that we can eradicate from society. There will always be people that try to subvert the process. There will always be people that don't agree with the fundamental principles of where they live. It is what it is. The point that I want to make in sympathy to what you and Christian are kind of saying right now is going back to the whole Adams quote. If people are not willing to self-regulate, or they're willing to accept a worldview which essentially makes the processes and the procedures you have untenable, they by definition destroy the process. And I think that's what we're starting to see right now is we've had an ever-growing sector of the population which looks at society as having responsibilities to them, but then not having responsibilities to society. And what I mean by that in broad terms is that if you want to be free, then there are certain responsibilities that attend that, right? If I want my decisions to be respected, I need to respect yours. If I want my property to be respected, I need to respect yours. But instead, what we've had is this growing sense of there's a category of people out there that are bad, and I can take from them in order to give to me because they're the oppressors, or because they have something that I don't, or because I want something and I don't have it and you have it, you're the bad guy. And that's the sort of person that does not seek to live in peaceful society with others. That's someone that believes that they have some sort of inherent right to take what belongs to others. And the mechanism that they currently use is the government. But what we see is that's never enough. That's why you see places like California where they refuse to enforce the law to the extent that they should. And people go in and they steal stuff and they walk out and they never get prosecuted. They never get arrested. And then you see people on X going, they're just trying to feed their family. Well, if the way that you're going to, quote, feed your family is by stealing a bunch of stuff from the Apple store, then what you're doing is you're making it impossible for the people that work at the Apple store to feed their family. And if you are unwilling to see that that is the consequence of the sort of attitude that you've taken, well, then we can't live together because you believe it's okay to violate my rights to satisfy your wants. And that's untenable. And that is why I have probably given President Trump, like in my own mind, not that he's looking for Nick Freitas to give him leeway, but it's why I've been more open to the sort of measures that he's been taking. It's because I recognize that, look, a lot of the people, the reason why the left's arguments on this, Ezra Klein's article in the New York Times used to be something that I would pore over, that I would read, that I would try to look at their various arguments, that I would try to look at the ones that I thought had some
You
sort
would
of
take it on
validity.
its merits.
I would take it on its merits, and then I would respond. Please believe me that for the vast majority, with very few exceptions on the left, I don't care what their argument is anymore because I don't think it's ever delivered in good faith. Now, there are some people I still believe. I always bring this up. Delegate Marcus Simon in the Virginia House of Delegates, him and I agree on next to nothing. But you know what I recognized in 10 years? Every time he wanted to debate an issue, he debated it on what he believed were the merits of the arguments, the facts and evidence. He never accused me of being a racist or a bigot because I disagreed with him. We may have come to different conclusions. I will take him seriously when he engages with me because of that commitment to a basic standard of decency and argumentation and civil discourse. But for the vast majority of the left, when I see Ezra Klein make an argument, I look at him like, I don't care. And the reason I don't care is because if Kamala Harris was doing all of this to shut down everything during COVID, you'd be cheering her on.
Well, that's why I said
Your problem is not authoritarianism. Your problem is purely who's in charge when it is implemented.
this is exactly why I said I don't. And look, I think that reasonable people can disagree, but I do strongly feel like I myself could not remain a libertarian after COVID because I saw that the principles simply weren't working. Like all of these protections that we've been defending, all these principles, all these arguments about setting precedent, the left didn't care about any of that. They knelt before the mob, they burned down cities, they locked down the country, they threw protesters against the lockdowns in prison at the same time that they were letting protesters out onto the streets to destroy downtown. And then like in blue states where they had the votes to do it, they radically, and I mean radically, altered the criminal justice system in order to allow violent offenders out of prison early. You voted against all those bills.
Oh, I've seen it. The Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates, Don Scott, made his signature piece of legislation sentence credits. And we're not talking about, hey, we're going to let this 18-year-old out of jail early because he was rotting away in prison for possession of marijuana. No, that's not happening. No, it was, we're going to let violent offenders out early because the system failed them. And not only that, but again, they're willing to use the system when it suits them. And when it suits them is to thwart my attempt to protect my country. When it doesn't suit them is anytime else they want to get something done. And that's the part where it's like the moment you demonstrate that you are bad faith, I'm not interested in your arguments anymore. Why should I be? Because you're only using these sorts of arguments as a temporary setting, not as any sort of deep-seated commitment to something. And the way I can prove this is because Bill Maher, I would sit down and have a conversation with Bill Maher, because even though I disagree with Bill Maher on a host of public policy issues, I feel like he still has a basic commitment to truth. I don't feel like he is deliberately trying to subvert the system to overthrow it in order to replace it with something else. But for many swaths of the left, that's how I feel. Now, we've got to kind of wrap this up here.
Take us away.
There's one other thing we promised to do, and that was, so will Trump continue to be able to do this? I'm going to make an argument here that there's two things that Trump has done thus far that have that I think, again, someone like me that would typically be skeptical of some of his actions, not necessarily outright opposed, but skeptical and concerned. There's two things that he's done that I have noticed that I've been like, you know what? I'm willing to give him some room to operate. When it comes to the criminal justice side, one is he has picked the right issues. He has largely picked the right issues. Illegal immigration just became a massive problem. It's been a problem for decades now, but it became such an overwhelming miscarriage of justice under the Biden administration, and the deliberate lies that the left went over on why they couldn't secure the border and what they were actually trying to do. It was just so heinous that we had gotten to a point where it's like, this is not untenable. If we don't get control of this situation, we will lose our country. Because you can't import 20 million people in that space of time and not expect it to have significant impacts on your country. And the fact that Biden was not only okay with it, but was willing to do, the only time he started to crack down is when it got close to the election. It was just so apparent. So that was when he has been picking good issues. look, when it comes to the issues with the cartels, I understand that it's not just a supply problem, it's also a demand problem. I get that. But I also think we should be treating demand a certain way as well that many libertarians would not be happy with. When it comes to the supply, though, I'm sorry, I have studied this. I have studied this from an intel perspective and having unique access to certain data.
I'm glad you tacked that on, because I'm like sitting here thinking, how many times have I heard like
I've studied
liberal, this. I've studied this, but in your case, like you actually
let
have
me be more
firsthand
specific.
experience.
I have designed training programs using analytical software for people dealing with immigration issues. Okay. This is not simply a question. This is not someone bootlegging, moonshine. These are incredibly powerful organizations, which are largely not just criminal, but terrorist in nature. And even the crimes, even the things that you can look at as just crimes. When you are actively engaging in the human trafficking of children for the sex trade, I want you killed. I want you killed. Okay? And if special forces can help with that, I would have loved that mission when I was in First Special Forces Group. If you would have said, hey, Nick, hey, we're not going to be in Iraq anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to work with the Thai government to hunt down and track narco-terrorists and human traffickers, and we're going to put them in the ground. I'd have been like, where do I re-enlist indefinitely? So, got no problem with it. Sorry. We're past it. I'm sorry. That's the sort of organizations we're fighting. We're not just talking about somebody selling marijuana in their college dorm. We're talking about incredibly dangerous, incredibly subversive, and organizations that have teamed with not only terrorists that want to do us harm, but with foreign adversaries that want to do us harm, foreign governments that want to do us harm. So no, it is not just a criminal justice issue. It is also a national security issue. Sorry, that's what it is. The other thing that I think Trump has done incredibly well is he's been achieving results. Because that's the other part of this, right? You can agree, like what I just articulated was I said, this is a problem, this is a problem. I want him to deal with those problems. And now he has instituted measures to deal with the problems. The second question is, but is it working? I believe it is. I believe that the way he's addressed these issues with immigration, it's obviously worked at the border. Donald Trump proved that every single Democrat claim that the reason why we can't secure the border is because Republicans wouldn't vote for a bipartisan border bill was an absolute lie. Not a misrepresentation, not a difference of opinion, an absolute 100% lie. They lied to us. They did it deliberately. They wanted this to happen, and they were willing to allow it to happen on their watch because Donald Trump came in and within a couple of months, with no new legislation, with no new spin, shut it down. So it was clearly within both the constitutional authority and the capability of the federal government. So he did what he did, and he got results. I will tell you this, provided that Donald Trump, regardless of what the concerns are from libertarians, regardless of what the concerns are, even if Donald Trump continues to pick winning issues and he gets results, people are going to say, you know what? It's working. It's working. The one thing he has to avoid, the one thing that will derail all of this, is if he makes any sort of major mistakes. How do you make a major mistake? You either A, go after the wrong target, or B, you do something which completely falls flat on its face. And I'm going to give one example of this, right? Which is it's still within that realm of criminal justice, but not on the three topics we mentioned here. The Epstein files were a huge mistake. Huge mistake. And look, I am very supportive of the Trump administration. But truth is truth, and that was a mistake. You don't get to sit there and say, this is a big problem. You don't get to have Pam Pondy saying all this stuff is sitting on my desk. And then a couple of months later come out and essentially say, yeah, there isn't really a list, and there isn't really this, and we're not going to. You don't get to do that. You could have come in right off the bat and say, we thoroughly investigated this. We found out that there's no this. People would have been skeptical. They would have been angry, but you don't get to promise one thing and then not deliver. See, in every other thing that Trump has been doing, he's promised something and he's delivered. You promise something that people want, you fail to deliver, and then you criticize them for questioning you about it, that will break the loyalty faster than anything. So what I would say is, I think if Donald Trump continues to pick winning issues that people really care about, that they're concerned about, and that makes sense to the vast majority of people, just makes sense, and he continues to implement policies that work and produce tangible results, I think Trump does well in the midterms, and I think he's able to continue this through all 4 years. I think if he has major mistakes, though, by either picking bad issues or not delivering, now you run into problems where Democrats take the House. I don't think they're going to take the Senate, but they take the House, and now all of a sudden all you're going to get is 2 years of tribunals, House committees, basically investigating the Trump administration. That's all you're going to get. So that's my analysis.
Yeah, that's why he needs to work as fast as humanly possible. You know, when the left is in charge, they run as hard and as far as they can to the left to shift the Overton window. We need to do the same thing, but on the right, and run as hard and as far on the right as we possibly can. One thing we've learned with the left and with COVID and all of these other things is that they can get away with literally going so far. They can go so far, and they never end up being held accountable for it. We end up spending time trying to unravel everything they did. If we can just do that back to them at least once, it would be wonderful. Because what happens is every single time we've got our side that they're so worried about their reelection bids, and look at the long-term damage that'll be done if we go too far on this issue before everybody else is quite ready to go this far. If we go that far, it's going to ruin everything for the next election. I'm sick and tired of hearing that bull crap.
Same.
I am
Same.
tired
I
of
am
it
too.
because you know who doesn't do that and who gets everything to shift to the left is the freaking left. They keep going and everything continues to the left because they don't care about their next election. They're going to run as far and as fast as they can to make it so difficult to unravel this thing. And then what does the right do? We get in charge and we sit there and we piece by piece try to figure out how to do this, where it's not going to hurt too many people. And, all these people are on this system now, so we sure can't get rid of Obamacare, right?
I want to hurt the progressive DA I want people to be fired. I want people to be held accountable.
I want to make the environment so hostile to leftist ideas that they're going to struggle to unravel everything we do.
See,
that's what I want.
Tina's a post-liberal and she just doesn't use the phrase. Like, she might have been the original one.
All right.
But like the last thing I'll say on this is, look, COVID taught, I think, a lot of us that you can just do things. And it's unfortunate that the left did things that were very destructive, but you don't have to do the things that the left did. You can do other things.
Yeah.
And so I think it's quite frankly, I just think it's time for us to not leave them alone now.
Well, I'll tell you what, I do think that one of the most brilliant things that the Trump administration did right off the bat, and even though we didn't get anywhere near the cuts we wanted, there were so many left-leaning NGOs that were just living off of the dole, living off of our tax dollars. And they were the ones pushing a lot of this stuff. That's what we found out. Like they did such a good job of treating it as if it was this groundswell, as if it was this organic movement, only to find out later that, wait, my tax dollars were the ones that were funding the destruction of, children? And the answer was yes, it was. But
which is why they're not raising as much now.
It's not doing anywhere near as much as it used to be. And I think you should continue to do it. By the way, today's episode was once again brought to you by Ground News. Go over, use my link, ground.news/MTA. Go over there, get your 40% off the Vantage plan. It is a wonderful resource. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Let us know how we did. What'd you think of our analysis? What'd you think of the framing, the perspectives, and our overall conclusions? Leave us some more information in the comments. Plus, if you would like to actually be a part of the conversation as we're filming, go ahead and check out the link in the description. We'd love to have more people join our community and sit here in the chat, either asking us questions or giving us more ideas for new episodes. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.